If you're writing a novel, at some point you'll probably ask yourself, are my chapters too short? Are they too long? What is the best possible length for my chapters? Today I want to discuss this. I want to help you decide what is best for your book. By the way, my name's Brandon McNulty. I'm the author of Bad Parts, also the author of Entry Wounds, and welcome to my writing channel. One of my subscribers requested a video on the subject of how long should your opening chapters be. And I figured if I'm going to be discussing opening chapters, I might as well just discuss chapters in general and what is the best length for the chapters in your story. So we're going to talk about chapters today. We're going to talk about what is the purpose of a chapter. We're going to talk about what determines the length of a chapter. I'll give you some examples of popular novels and how long the chapters are, how long the average chapters are in those stories, and what you can learn from those. So we'll talk about that, but first I want to focus on what is the purpose of a chapter. And a chapter can do a number of different things. I think some of the most important things that chapters do, they make a larger work easier for a reader to digest, because you don't want to read a massive novel in one sitting. Another thing chapters do, they allow you to change the point of view, the scene, the scenario, the setting, any number of things. Whenever you get to the end of a chapter, an audience expects something to change in the next scene. Another important thing chapters do, they help you manage the pacing and suspense in your stories. If you want to vary up the pace and keep the readers on their toes, you can start off by having some consistent chapter lengths as far as maybe like 10 pages, and then later on you can shrink things down to 5 pages when you want to speed things up, or you could expand things up to 15 pages if you want to slow down the pacing and let the readers get a little comfortable before things get crazy. Now let's move on to the question of what determines chapter length. I'm going to say there are 3 specific things that determine chapter length. The first of these is genre expectations. And of course, genre expectations are audience expectations. Each genre has a specific audience that gravitates toward it. So if you're writing, for instance, a thriller, that audience expects shorter chapters because a thriller has to move at a quick pace. But if you're writing something like literary sci-fi or epic fantasy, those genres have audiences that expect longer chapters. And in those longer chapters, you're going to be giving some world building, some lore. You're going to be giving the history of the families that are involved, or maybe even the science that's involved if it is sci-fi. So keep in mind that different audiences have different expectations, and you need to meet those expectations. They will forgive you if you have sometimes some longer chapters in a thriller or sometimes some shorter chapters in an epic fantasy, but for the most part there is a specific expectation and it exists for a reason. The second thing that will determine chapter length is your own personal preferences and your skill set as a writer. For instance, if you simply enjoy shorter chapters and that's what you like to write and that's what you're most comfortable with, it's kind of senseless to force yourself to write longer chapters. I know for me, whenever I write a chapter that's over 1,500 words, I start to freak out and I start to think this is way too long. I got to find ways to cut this down. There's something wrong here. And this is just something that I have come to expect of myself over time. I know where my sweet spot is as far as how long a chapter should be. So when I write a chapter and it's stretching up past 1,500, and especially if it goes up past 2,000 words, that's where I start to say, okay, I need to either break this chapter down, or I need to cut some things out, or I need to revise it, whatever it may be. Now, depending on you, you might be more comfortable writing those longer chapters. That might be where you do your best writing. Maybe you really need to set the stage, and you need to delve into a character's perspective and sprinkle in some world building, and you need maybe 3,000 words or 4,000 words in a chapter in order to do that. If that works, and if that's how you do your best storytelling, go for it. Don't shut yourself down. Don't try to force yourself into doing something shorter just because maybe it's in vogue or you feel obligated to, or whatever it may be. Figure out what works best for you and your skill set, because if you're not happy with what you're writing, it's going to leak through onto the page and your readers are going to be disappointed. And then the third thing that determines chapter length is what your story demands. Different parts of the story will demand certain chapter lengths in order to convey a sense of excitement or convey a sense of relaxation or whatever it may be. Especially if you start off your story maybe, let's say, with 10-page chapters, and you have 10 pages, 10 pages, 10 pages, but you get toward the middle of the story and that's where things start ramping up in terms of tension and excitement. Then all of a sudden you might start shrinking things down to 8 pages, 7 pages, 6 pages in order to convey a sense that things are moving along at a more rapid pace. And then the readers are really on edge because they notice that, oh man, these chapters are moving really quick. The story's moving really quick. Now, another thing to keep in mind with this, if you want to slow things down, you can expand your chapters a little bit. Instead of maybe you have 10-page chapter, 10-page chapter, chapter, 10-page chapter, and then you want to slow things down a little bit, then all of a sudden maybe you have a 15-page chapter or whatever it may be. You can play around with the pacing in your novel by varying up the chapter lengths. If you ever need something slow and thoughtful, expand your chapters out a little more. If you ever need something tight and exciting and heart-pounding, shorten things up. Now let's take a look at some popular novels and their average chapter lengths, and this might help you out as far as deciding what is the best average word count for you. So the first thing we'll take a look at is The Hunger Games, the first book in the trilogy, and the average chapter length is 3,700 words, and that comes out to about 13 pages per chapter. And I remember when I read this book, it was very consistent with the chapter length. Like every single chapter was about 13 pages. This kind of got a little predictable for me and it bummed me out at times, but it didn't stop me from loving the story. So if you want to be consistent, by all means go for it. If you want to vary things up, like I mentioned in the previous section of this video, you can do that as well. Another story, this one came out in the 90s. It really flew under the radar. Not a whole lot of people read this book. It's called Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Again, very much an overlooked gem. But the chapters in this story are about 4,400 words per chapter. So that comes out to about 18 pages, give or take. Now with Game of Thrones, the first book in the series has an average chapter length of about 5,000 words. So that's our largest one here out of these examples, and that's an epic fantasy story. That genre is something that, definitely you have an audience that expects longer chapters and a longer book in general. One of my favorite books from about 10 years ago is Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn, and this is a suspense thriller type novel, very much an Alfred Hitchcock type of story, and the average chapter length in this one is about 2,300 words. Now if you're looking for a story with shorter chapters than that, check out Along Came a Spider by James Patterson. That has an average chapter length of about 1,100 words, which is about 5 pages per chapter. And that's actually a lot by James Patterson standards, because many of his stories have super short chapters that are in the 250 to 500 word range. One more author I want to look at is Stephen King. I don't have a specific average word count for him because he often mixes up the length of his chapters in order to create rhythm and suspense in his stories. One thing he does in a lot of his books is he will often have a chapter that is broken down into several different scenes, and he will number these scenes 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then he moves on to the next chapter 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And these scene breaks help break up a larger chapter. Like the chapter itself might be 75 pages, but if you have 6 or 7 scenes within it, it goes along a lot smoother, it's broken down, and you have those scene breaks, aka pit stops sometimes they're called, that help make things a little easier to digest for the audience. So if you are somebody who's writing really long chapters and you're wondering, oh man, am I doing this wrong, or should I break it down into other chapters? But no, I don't want to break it down into other chapters because I think everything should stay together as one whole unit. If you still want to keep it as one whole unit, but you want to make it a little easier to digest, don't forget about scene breaks. Now before I wrap up this video, I want to talk specifically about opening chapters, since my one subscriber requested that especially. And the thing about opening chapters is that I think ideally you want them to be around the average chapter length of your story. And sometimes this is easy to do, especially if you're a writer who consistently hits a certain length for all your chapters. But sometimes there are scenarios where the first chapter in your book is going to be the longest chapter in your book, or it's going to be the shortest chapter in your book. I've read several different books out there where maybe it opened up with a chapter that was just a page or two, just to really set the scene or give us like a cliffhanger or something suspenseful that kicked off the rest of the story. And on the other hand, I've read stories where the opening chapter is kind of long, maybe because it's a prologue or because it has a lot of information to convey in order to set up the main story. And I think the key thing to remember with opening chapters is that you need to decide, what does your opening chapter have to accomplish? And there are certain things that an opening chapter will have to accomplish. For instance, it might have to establish the genre, or might have to give a sense of what types of scenarios that the reader is to expect from this story, or it might want to set up the themes that are going to be at play in this story. Depending on what you need to accomplish with your opening chapter, the length is going to vary, and there's nothing to be ashamed of if it's too long or too short compared to the rest of the chapters in your story. For instance, with my book Entry Wounds, the opening chapter I think is the second longest chapter in the book, and this was something I stressed out over, I'm not going to lie. I actually broke it down into 2 at one point, and I had chapter 1 and chapter 2, and then when I had my beta readers looking at it, they're like, I don't know why you just don't combine the first two chapters into one. So I was like, okay, fine, I'll just make it one chapter. I'll just live with it. And, you know, it works. It works because that particular scene that opens up the story needs to be one unit. It doesn't work if it's broken up into two chapters. It just comes off as a little weird if you cut it in two. So, I mean, if you find that your opening chapter needs to do something important in order to set up the rest of the story, and that opening chapter needs to be short or long or whatever, just roll with it. As long as you establish what is important, as long as your writing is well done and it keeps the readers on the page and the suspense is there and you're not indulging in over describing things, you can get away with a chapter of any length at the beginning of your story. But again, you want to get closer to that average chapter length if possible. So I hope this helps. Question of the day: what is the average chapter length for your current work in progress? Let us know in the comments section below. Thank you guys for watching. If you want to support the channel, please pick up a copy of either one of my novels. Also, be sure to check out my other videos. Hit the like and subscribe buttons for me. Share this video with a friend. And as always, remember to keep on writing.